Hello and welcome to this special Space Day interview. My name is Richard Stephenson and I'm the Chief Executive of AeroTime. And I'm also a huge fan of the Smithsonian Institute's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, DC. I first visited the museum aged 16 on my first visit to the city, and I've been back many, many times. I'm already looking forward to my next visit as soon as that is allowed. And so here on Space Day, it seemed like the perfect day to interview Margaret Weitekamp. In addition to serving as the department chair, Dr. Weitekamp curates the museum's social and cultural history of spaceflight collection. That's more than 5,000 artifacts that include space memorabilia, space science fiction, and all sorts of other things. These everyday mementos of the space age, which include toys, games, medals, awards, complete the story about spaceflight told by the museum's collection of space hardware and technologies. Margaret earned a BA from the University of Pittsburgh and an MA and PhD in history from Cornell University. During her graduate work, she was a Mellon Fellow in Humanities and spent a year in residence at the NASA Headquarters History Office in Washington, DC. She's the author of numerous articles, and including the award-winning book, Right Stuff, Wrong Sex, America's First Woman in Space program. She's currently completing a new book, A Social and Cultural History of Space Memorabilia. Margaret, it's a real honor to have the opportunity to speak to you on Space Day especially. So thank you indeed for joining AeroTime.
Oh, I'm delighted. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
So Margaret, there is so much that I want to talk to you about today, but I think it's only right that we start this discussion by talking about Michael Collins. Michael Collins, who recently passed away at the age of 90. General Collins was most famous as part of the crew of Apollo 11. But what some people might not know is that he played a very significant role in the creation of the National Air and Space Museum. Now, you recently wrote an article about his work, so perhaps you can tell our viewers a bit more about this.
Yes, most people know General Michael Collins as the command module pilot from Apollo 11, and he took a wonderful picture out of the command module looking at the lunar module against the moon, and then in the distance the Earth, and had that experience of being that singular person who was away from literally all of humanity when he was going around the moon for Apollo 11. But he was also the third director of the National Air and Space Museum. Now, the museum existed as a collection and a staff and had displays on the National Mall in a building called the Arts and Industries Building, but it didn't have its own dedicated space. And so after Apollo 11, after a stint at the US Department of State, Michael Collins actually asked for the role of being the director of the museum at that critical point where the museum building had been authorized, but there was no funding yet. And so he really came in and led the campaign and got the museum not only funded, but also built and opened by the United States birthday on July 4th, 1976 was the bicentennial, the 200th birthday of the United States. So the idea was a museum on the mall by the bicentennial, and he really delivered.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly did. And some 20 years later, I think, when I first visited, I was incredibly grateful to him for all of his efforts and his team in putting this together. And you mentioned that he was the third director of the museum, and you also mentioned that he worked tirelessly to collect all of the artifacts to actually set the museum up and to allow it to open its doors on July the 1st of 1976. But what was the actual vision for this project? What was the actual purpose of this project when it all started? And what exactly did Collins and others involved in this activity really want the museum to achieve?
They really were seeking a national museum with the capital N that would stand on the world stage. and tell the story not only of US aviation and spaceflight, but also of its position in the world. And so they were looking for displays and artifacts that would draw people in, that would teach them about the history of aviation going back to ballooning, but through to the invention of powered flight by the Wright brothers in 1903. And then when they opened in the mid-1970s, the Apollo lunar missions, putting human beings on the surface of the moon, were really recent history. They had only ended 4 years before. So the vision was really to create a world-class museum that would tell those stories and engage people with that encounter with the real objects.
So he joined NASA in 1963, I believe, as an astronaut. That's almost 60 years ago, and obviously so much has changed since then. And I'm quite sure that he lived to see many of the things that would have been unthinkable in the 1960s. So although General Collins didn't step on the moon himself, he was there in the command module of Apollo 11 as Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong actually took those giant leaps. But we've not been back to the moon for so long. 1972, I think, was the last time. So, when do you think we're going to go back to the moon? And what do you think his generation of astronauts would want to see happen next in space?
Well, we know that his generation of astronauts and Collins himself was interested in bold steps in space. He came to the museum for the 40th anniversary of Apollo 11 and spoke about just that, and really was interested in seeing human beings going back to the moon, even perhaps onto Mars, thinking about big things. And I think that what we see now is the beginnings of those big things. The pace of change hasn't been quite as fast as I think people hoped from the beginnings of the space age in 1957 with the Soviet Sputnik, on to then eventually landing on the moon and walking around in 1969. But I think that we've seen a development of a broad infrastructure. The International Space Station is a wonderful collaboration in low Earth orbit doing research. People are already thinking about going back to the moon, and we're watching rovers on Mars not only rove around and essentially act as surrogate geologists, but the Ingenuity helicopter on Mars is the first flying thing that we've sent to another planet. So I think we might not have had the pace of change by the year 2000 that I think folks might have hoped for in the 1960s, but I think we're seeing a vibrant and deep, rich field of study, both in terms of science and practical applications in spaceflight.
Seeing that activity on Mars was just incredible. I mean, I don't know what it's like for you and your colleagues, but whenever you see one of those huge developments taking place in front of you, and you just imagine that we're seeing pictures being beamed back from a different planet, it's absolutely incredible. So, I mean, how exciting does it get at your end when those kind of things are happening?
It's very exciting because we want to see these things succeed. And long term, I think we're thinking about how will we tell these stories to our visitors now and to our visitors in the future. Surely someday when there are human beings on Mars, we're going to send a Smithsonian curator and try to get Ingenuity back so that we can put it in the building that Collins built on the National Mall, or perhaps we'll have an annex on Mars by then. But I think we're really thinking about how do we tell that story of what has been happening now and what's next, and really bringing that into context for people so that they understand how those things that they're seeing on the news build on the history that we have at the museum. And I should mention that one of the things that Mike Collins did with the building of the National Air and Space Museum was also the founding of the Center for Earth and Planetary Studies. So we have a science division of contemporary geologists, geographers, people who are doing work on icy planets, icy moons in the outer solar system, who are driving the Mars rovers from their offices, or in fact in quarantine from their homes. So we can't stay in close touch because some of our colleagues are the scientists who are getting the NASA grants, who are working on these actual planetary exploration projects, thinking about astronomy, thinking about planetary geology, and that keeps those of us in the Space History Department honest.
I mean, it's incredible when you think about that. In the first few minutes of our discussion, we've covered the last 60 years, and we've probably just covered the next 200 as well. And I just think that's incredible. When you start talking about space exploration, you can cover a lengthy period in a very, very short time. But one of the things I really want to ask you about is how certain things have changed over that last sort of 60-year period. And I think one of the things is very much covered in one of your books, which was entitled Right Stuff, Wrong Sex, America's First Woman in Space Program. Now, here at AeroTime, we've actually been running a campaign celebrating the contribution of women in aviation. And so I'd be keen to ask you whether you feel enough has changed in terms of gender equality in the space program, and whether you think more work is still to be done. I mean, do you think enough progress has been made in relation to women in space?
I think it's a long, slow climb to change. And so what we see is definite progress, but not yet really full equality. And I think that what you see is the most public face of NASA and of space programs is often the astronaut corps. But we know that there are thousands more people on the ground who are mission controllers and scientists and engineers. And what we're seeing in those pipelines of the people who are coming into those fields in engineering schools or science and technology programs is more and more women and girls participating. And so I think that what you see is a slow change that has come because really historically the changes that support that are very recent. It's really only in the 1970s that you start to get this opening of professional schools, military academies, military service, flight training in professional capacities that allow women to really participate more fully. And I think those are the things that allow then the next generation to really be doing these great things in aerospace. So it's certainly something that we are excited about promoting at the National Air and Space Museum. We're delighted to think that, you know, someday the first woman on Mars is walking through our exhibits somewhere, getting a touch of inspiration and going back to study very hard. And programs like yours really, I think, dovetail with that effort to try to think about how we tap into all of our talents in order to do these great things in space.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I really hope that here at AeroTime, we get to report more about the developments that take place over the years to come. And I hope that we can stay in contact and carry on this discussion because it's so important. But I want to turn now and focus very much on your role today, your role at the National Air and Space Museum. And you're the curator of the museum's social and cultural history of spaceflight collection. You oversee 5,000 artifacts that include some really historic and really interesting things, space memorabilia, even science fiction memorabilia, and all sorts of other things. It really is a fascinating, and it's a pretty eclectic collection, I think it's fair to say. I mean, one minute you're looking at some sort of academic gown, and the next minute you're looking at a kid's lunchbox, but all related to space. And I think it's an incredible collection. It's an incredible thing to have. But this is probably a really unfair question to ask a curator, but do you have a favorite item? And how do you go about building such an eclectic collection like this?
Great questions. Who is your favorite child? So I deal with objects that show and illustrate how spaceflight has been imagined and how spaceflight has been remembered. And so I would say probably the object that has been most challenging and in many ways very rewarding is the 11-foot studio model of the Star Trek Starship Enterprise. So this is not a new collection. This is something that existed before me, indeed existed before the building on the National Mall was completed, but that was acquired in 1974. We did a massive restoration conservation project on that artifact some 5 years ago in order to put it on display in the Boeing Milestones of Flight Hall. So that I think was very rewarding for me, both as a curator and as a fan. And I think those things overlap very much. So that's my favorite big object. We also have a wonderful charm bracelet that was put together by Tony Foster. Her husband, Bob Foster, was an aerospace engineer. And it just really illustrates both their relationship, his work, their family, but also the whole community that grew up in Florida, where he was working near the Kennedy Space Center to support space efforts in the 1960s. And I'm excited that that's going on display in the new Destination Moon exhibit that's going to be opening in a couple of years. So from big things to small things, what we're really looking for are rich objects that tell multiple stories, and that when we put them out for you, begin to allow you to, through those objects, connect with some of those bigger stories of spaceflight.
Amazing. And actually, you've mentioned a couple of my real favorites, but you know, what about the people that actually come? What about the visitors to the museum? Do they agree with you about their favorites, or what are the most popular artifacts and exhibits that you have?
So I answered probably unfairly because I picked my favorite objects from my collection, but the museum holds the original 1903 Wright Flyer, built by the Wright brothers, as a real centerpiece. And I think when you see that, you get a sense of the engineering that they did to put that together. I have to say another favorite of mine that's not in my collection is John Glenn's Friendship 7 spacecraft, in which he became the first American to orbit the Earth in February of 1962. Senator Glenn was a great friend of the museum, and seeing that, just how small that spacecraft is, it's only really about 6 feet across, about 2 meters wide. And that, I think, illustrates kind of the daring of what he was willing to do as a pilot and an engineer. So I think people really want to see also Columbia, the command module that Michael Collins returned in and in fact signed before he left, which we have on display at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center out by Dulles Airport. So I think those real things, the real craft, give people some appreciation and some imagination about what it must have been like to be flying in those things.
So you've kind of touched on my next question a little bit, but I'm going to ask you anyway, and I'm sure there'll be other things that you'll want to think about. But when you have a collection like this, you're always thinking about the things that are not in the collection currently. So you must always be thinking about those things that you really want to get your hand on. So in the future, what artifact are you most looking forward to having in your museum, or which artifact do you really want to get your hands on?
One of the things that I don't know that people know about curators is our job is really to say no more than we say yes, right? The job of building a coherent collection is really about saying this is what we have in, and these are the things that we don't touch, which allows us to take better care and to be more judicious about what we're doing with the collection that we have. So we say no a lot to even things that are really interesting, but because we need to be able to focus well. So I will offer a couple of examples. The Viking lander on Mars is one that one of the major scientists and administrators who helped put that together after that landed died tragically in a mountaineering accident. And so they've named that site for him. So it's always been, we have a plaque in the museum's collection that NASA gave us with the intention that we would actually bring that when we go to Mars, to put that on there to make it the memorial station that they wanted for him. I think the dream would always be at some point of being able to bring that in. There are unusual things that we've missed. There was a Cabbage Patch Kid, if anyone remembers a craze from the 1980s of these little kind of chubby baby dolls that came with individual personalities and a birth certificate, and they were all kind of individually designed by computer because they could vary the hair and the eyes and things like that. Well, there was one of those that was in a young astronaut's outfit and that was flown on a space shuttle. And I always thought, like, oh, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to have on display? This has been to space, and that's a very rare and wonderful thing to get things back from space. It turns out it took a couple of years of searching to realize that it had been brought back to Earth. It had been brought to the White House. It had been given to the Reagan White House, and the staff put it in the holiday toy drive. And it went to a needy child for Christmas that year who got not only a space shuttle Cabbage Patch Kid, but one that had been to space. And so that is one that kind of, it's gone now. We don't have a way of tracking it. And I always think, oh, that would have been interesting if we'd been able to get it. So the stories behind the things that we can't get are sometimes just as interesting as some of what we have.
So, I mean, do you think that child actually knows the story behind the Cabbage Patch Kid that he got?
I'm fairly sure they don't. And it was a time in the mid 1980s when the focus in museums would have really been on the spacecraft, on the spacesuits, on the airplanes, on the hardware. And that would have been the assumption about how you were telling these stories, and these other kinds of softer, in that case, literally softer objects that tell a social and cultural context. They wouldn't necessarily have been thinking yet that that was an important piece to keep. And so this was just a place where I think the goodness in their hearts to do right by charity and to get a needy child this very rare and desired toy then meant that that little bit of history that was attached to it of having been in space is lost to us.
Well, I think we're starting a new campaign here today, Margaret, to find that Cabbage Patch Kid, because if anybody is aware of an astronaut Cabbage Patch Kid, Margaret is going to be your new best friend, I think. So get in touch.
There are many of them out there. This one I'm not sure is track downable, but I would love to be proved wrong.
Well, I'm looking forward to somebody getting in touch now. I really hope that happens. But like, moving on from Cabbage Patch Kids, what about the future? What about the new artifacts that are going to be coming your way? I'm sure at some point relatively soon. Do you already have plans for Mars rock in the museum?
Mars rock would be wonderful. We famously have a moon rock that is actually held by NASA. It's not owned by the museum. All moon rocks are controlled by NASA because they're research pieces, but they recognized very early on the value of being able to allow the public to connect literally with that piece and to be able to come in and have it be touchable. So that is something we would love to have, a touchable Mars rock next to our touchable moon rock. I think people would enjoy that very much. And we're already thinking about how we can represent new spaceflight efforts, whether those are in spacesuit design, whether those are in actual human spacecraft, or whether that's from planetary science. We rely often on the fact that it's a good thing about spaceflight that you don't just build one thing and send it out into space, never to see it again. There's usually an engineering test model, if not a spaceflight duplicate. So a piece that is identical and could have gone into space, but is the one that's kept at home to do the engineering on. And so sometimes we are showing people things that are real, but may not have been flown from space. And so that is, I think, a part of what we think about when we're trying to figure out how best to tell these stories. And then we're also looking a lot beyond the walls of what can we put on your phone? What can we show you in a video? How can we have a chat and talk directly to people and make that a part of what we think of as the core museum experience?
I mean, I remember coming and seeing that moon rock, and that was, it's a massive thrill to think that it's come from somewhere else. I mean, there's something really quite special about that, and I think there's space right next to it for a nice bit of Mars rock as well. So I'll look forward to that being the case at some point in the not too distant future.
Our display of that has a picture of exactly where that rock came from. We can show you that physical rock on the surface of the moon before it was collected. And I like that now as a way of really grounding it.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it really is incredible. You mentioned video, and you mentioned other ways of trying to interact with people, and there are millions of people, billions of people around the world who haven't had the opportunity to come to the Smithsonian, haven't had the chance to come to the National Air and Space Museum. So trying to work out how you can bring all of these things to life for those people who can't physically be there, I think is incredibly important. And when you think about the last year, especially, of course, where you've had to close your doors and all of that, that the richness of everything inside that building has been closed off to everybody. I mean, video and other channels must be really important in the future of your museum and many others.
That's a turn that the museum had been making before COVID-19, but it certainly paid off when we were all sent home and when essentially world travel stopped. And so being able to show people the artifacts online to be able to enrich what people can search for in terms of images and information about objects is really important. But we've also been trying to get our curatorial staff and our educational staff kind of out in the world through chats, through regular programs that our education program runs for middle school students as well as for the general public. So we've been really trying to think creatively about how we do those things online, including continuing our lecture series where we're able to bring some of the real experts in the world of aerospace, whether aviation or space flight, to you through the platform of the Smithsonian Institution. So it's been a very useful exercise in pushing us to develop that even faster, even further. And I think it's going to be something that you'll see as a lasting effect on the other side of this recent episode.
It's hard to imagine that there's an awful lot of positive things coming out of this COVID period. But actually, when you think about some of the advancements that museums and other institutions like yours are making, especially in regard to being able to bring things to life and to share things through new channels, I mean, there's some positivity there. And I just wonder, what do you have in store for the future outside of developing video and your new channels to a much bigger market, a much bigger audience? What else have you got in store? What am I going to find on my next visit when I come to see you?
Well, on your next visit, the building will have been almost completely rehabbed. So the museum began a massive construction transformation project a few years ago. And so the museum on the National Mall is being almost entirely rebuilt, one end to the next. And we have been redesigning all of the exhibits inside. So we're doing 22 different exhibits all at once. And it turns out you can do an awful lot of exhibit development remotely. So we've been able to continue at a great pace with the curatorial staff, working with our collection staff and working with contractors to really think about what those new exhibits are going to be. And then, as I said, thinking about how we extend that experience so that we're not only focused on who's in the physical building and what stories can we tell, and we look forward to the millions of visitors again on the other side of this. But I think what you'll really see is the extension of that, both for the people who are in the building and then the folks who cannot get to visit us in person. I hope will come to what's already a renewed website and thinking about all of this kind of digital content, these stories, these lectures that we've been able to put on the internet and really get out to a global audience.
And today, obviously, is Space Day. And this was, there is no better day to have this conversation with you than Space Day. So how will you be marking Space Day? Are there any special celebrations planned? Is there anything going on that people should know about? What's in store for you today?
So at risk of being slightly flippant, I'm going to say, every day is Space Day for the Space History Department at the National Air and Space Museum. So I think what we're doing really is focusing on this transformation of the building, of the restoration and the revitalization of all of the artifacts and the exhibits inside. I think that you'll see more global stories being told, more diverse stories being told, a more complete story being told of aviation and spaceflight, and one that is really grounded in the past and in the artifacts and in those stories, but then also very much looking to the future and very interested in making connections with visitors so that they see themselves when they come into the building, but they also see what's possible and are perhaps inspired to be going out and being a part of that change and a part of that development. So really that's our core mission every day, and especially on Space Day.
Nice. And so, Margaret, we've talked about the moon, we've talked about Mars, we've talked about your amazing eclectic collection, but what does the future of space exploration hold in store for you? What do you want to see happen next? Are you one of these people that have a dream to get on one of those rockets and go off into the far-flung corners of the universe, or are you happy here on Earth just managing the collections of everything that people bring back?
I think there might have been a moment when if there was any good reason to send an historian into space, I would have been delighted to go. I think we all live a little vicariously through the astronauts and the space travelers when they're going into space. But I also think that when we're looking at what's happening in terms of planetary science and astronomy, I just think that's mind blowing how much humanity kind of stuck on this little third rock from the sun on this planet has been able to discover and discern about the universe that we live in, and the other places that people now know as places, not just a little red dot in the sky, but thinking about Mars as a place where we're roaming around and we know what that geography looks like in a really intimate way. So I think that as we look to the future, we're trying to think about what are the best objects, what are the physical things that we can put on display that will put people in touch with that sense of awe, of adventure, of inspiration, of exploration. And how do we continue to build this collection going forward in the future? Even in the middle of our construction, we're actively collecting, actively building new exhibits and thinking about what's next.
Well, Margaret, thank you so much. I mean, that brings us to the end of this interview. I'm pretty sure that you and I could probably speak for the next 5 or 6 hours, I guess. But unfortunately, that is the end of the interview. But I just want to say a huge thank you for joining AeroTime today on Space Day, and a huge thank you for making some of my dreams come true to have this conversation. And I'm really looking forward to getting back to the museum. And as I said, I really hope that next time we can do this, we can set up an interview in person at the museum, perhaps in the shadow of one of your favorite artifacts, and we can actually show people the museum, and we can bring that museum to life and show them the brilliance of it. And I think that, well, hopefully both you and I would love to do that for so many people watching around the world. I'll never forget my first visit to the museum and the many subsequent visits that I have made. And I always have to pinch myself to remember that it's actually free. It's free to get into this place. The whole Smithsonian is free, and I think that's an amazing thing as well. And I will be back there just as soon as this very strange period in our history is over, and I can make it back to DC. But I can honestly tell you it is one of my favorite places. So thank you so much. I wish you and your colleagues all the very best in the future when you do reopen your doors, and I hope that is very soon indeed. So that brings us to the end of this special Space Day interview. My name is Richard Stephenson, and you've been watching AeroTime. Goodbye.